Hello, and welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your special co-host, Michael R.G. Connolly. Firstly, I want to thank the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for working with Michael Colonier and myself to create and sponsor this position. The Society is the primary professional association for historians of the era, and I'm sincerely grateful to be the graduate student representative for the Society. In addition to events and opportunities for scholars and emerging scholars, Shigate publishes an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. If you like this show, you'll love the journal, and you might want to consider joining the Society, particularly if you are a graduate or an undergraduate student. You can find out more at shigate.org. The Zouave outfit is likely not the first thing people think of when they imagine 19th century France. But the iconic red baggy trousers, collarless short jacket, and fez with turban became iconic by the 1870s. Used by the military and theater performances throughout Europe and the United States, the outfit allowed its wearer to cross the boundaries of gender and race and was, in the words of today's guests, the uniform of liberal empire. In their new book, Zouave Theaters, Transnational Military Fashion and Performance, historians Carol E. Harrison and Thomas J. Brown examine the spread and popularity of Zouaverie in France, the United States, the Papal States, Canada, and elsewhere to explore its connections to colonialism, race, gender, fashion, and military tactics and dress. Carol E. Harrison and Thomas J. Brown are both professors of history at the University of South Carolina. Carol is an expert on French, European, and Catholic history, whose first book, The Bourgeois Citizen in 19th Century France, explored the formation of male bourgeois elite in provincial France. Her second book, Romantic Catholics, examines how lay French women, men, and children practice their faith. Her current book project follows the controversies surrounding the First Vatican Council from the perspective of lay Catholic women. Tom researches the Civil War and Reconstruction era with a specialization in cultural and intellectual history. His most recent monograph, Civil War Monuments and Militarization of America, received the Tom Watson Brown Book Award from the Society of Civil War Historians. It's great seeing you both again, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So before we really get into the substance of the book, I want to ask you about working together. You both are very well published historians in your separate fields, but haven't published anything together before. What was that process like? And are there really major differences in the way French history is done compared to American history?
Well, I should probably say up front, we haven't worked together on a book, but we are married. So we worked together on other things like yard work, and so we have some experience of working together. And I will also say that because we are married together and we work together in the same department, we also work together on department matters. We have always found that talking history is a good antidote to talking about history department politics, right? It's a way to we both love history. We're both 19th century specialists. Talking about that shared interest seems to me to be much healthier than talking about like work politics. So we've always talked history a lot. The big difference is this time we wrote history together. Is that fair?
Fair enough. Fair enough. And to a certain extent, there was a division of labor, and we each had a sphere. There are chapters that Carol wrote, chapters I wrote. There were some parts that we did write together, and we edited each other's parts. Yeah. So there was a lot of cooperation. It was fun. It was fun. We batted this topic around over a very long period of time.
Yeah.
So it's the culmination of many dinner table conversations, lots of tidbits, that kind of thing. It's like, oh, guess what I found today? That sort of thing. Buying a postcard on eBay or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like it worked, and it definitely did work in the book. But to begin with, I was hoping you could explain to the audience what Zouave dress is.
Here, well, we'll put the book up. So the front cover of the book we both just love. LSU did a great job on it, and the front cover is paper soldiers in Zouave dress. So these were fairly cheap. This particular sheet is French, 19th century, printed and colored. And kids would cut them out and glue them to cardboard, and you had your little army there. And so you can see the outfit there, and it's very striking. So it's extremely wide, bright red trousers cinched at the knee. The original waist measurement was 2.5 meters, so they're very baggy. And then a jacket that is open, so collarless and open, which is important. So a traditional military uniform, you'd be very buttoned up, and you'd have to hold your head up. So the open jacket is important, and then a turban, and then on a turban on top of a sort of fez, and a giant cummerbund sash, all very bright colored, all very striking, and the aesthetics of the uniform, the fact that men and women too looked really good in this uniform, and they were striking in this uniform, and it was a costume as much as a uniform, is really important to the international success of the Zouave look.
And so it's got ethnic dimensions. It's got kind of military battlefield type dimensions. From the, well, maybe let Carol talk about the ethnic dimensions and how it kind of comes to be.
Yeah, so it starts in the French army in 1830 with the French conquest of North Africa, and it emerges out of debates about how to garrison the new colony cheaply. And the original idea is that they will recruit native soldiers, give them French officers, and that that's a cheap path to garrisoning a colony. And that's not original. That's like the British playbook in India. That's fairly tried and true. It did not work that well in North Africa. Native soldiers very often deserted. They very often deserted taking their weapons with them. But what did work is the idea that you could sell Frenchmen on wearing the outfit. So within relatively few years of the creation of the first Zouave units, the Zouaves are mostly Frenchmen dressed as natives. And that was a tremendous formula for success. And it also kind of set up the Zouave tradition of cross-dressing. And that's really what excites us about this look, is that there's always when somebody puts on a Zouave uniform, there's always a kind of sense of play and of performing something that you're not. You're a Frenchman dressed as a North African native. Later, when the British government adopts it in the West Indies, you are a Black West Indian dressed as a French North African. When Catholic soldiers defending the Pope adopt it, you're devout young Catholic men dressed as Muslim tribesmen. And then, of course, women very often wear it, and women too become Zouave. So that whole kind of cross-dressing, the sense of playfulness and possibility is central to the success of the look.
And in the United States context, that idea of this is a European appropriation of an African look translates very directly to blackface minstrelsy. And so blackface minstrels picked up on that right away, and they had Zouave acts before you really saw people in Zouave uniforms and military outfits in the United States. So the passage from a military uniform to a stage costume is a huge part of the book, the relationship between those two, and the way that it goes back the other way, the way the stage costumes influence the military uniforms, is a huge part of the book in all these theaters. Hence the title Zouave Theaters.
Yeah, I really, especially by the end of the book, I really appreciated the title. It really picks up on every element in a way that I didn't fully understand just from looking at the title and the subtitle. But to go back to French Algeria, you talk about how like its establishment was genocidal in its brutality, and that quote, tales of Zouave ruthlessness both exposed and disguised, celebrated and excused a French capacity for cruelty, which I just thought was a fabulously illustrative sentence. How did Zouave methods, what were Zouave methods, and how did they change French colonialism?
Well, in the first years, the first decade of their existence, the French Zouave are mostly putting down native resistance to French colonialism. And so their main method is the raid. They raid native villages, they destroy storehouses, they destroy orchards, they kill livestock, they terrorize people. And that is the method. That is what Zouave do. And the stories that circulate about Zouave in the first years of their existence really kind of delight in that brutality. So Zouave stories are always about, like, Zouaves who cut off their enemies' ears, as a kind of warning, or wear cut off ears strung on a necklace around their neck. And on the one, and that is obviously deliberately brutal. It's deliberately violent. It's terrorizing. It's meant to be. And putting it with the Zouave uniform, the stories about, like, severed ears and severed heads as well often come with a kind of, like, sense of bonhomie, and, like, well, they're just sort of, that's the type they are, and it's related to the fact that they might be native. Um, so that's, I think, the sense in which the uniform authorizes and excuses. So the stories about severed heads will often come along with a story that suggests, well, can you tell if they're French or they're native? So lots of stories circulating about commanding officer encountering a particularly praiseworthy Zouave, meaning a particularly brutal, terrifying Zouave, and asking him, what tribe do you belong to? And he says, I'm from the Beni Muftaum. Beni being the North African identifier, but Muftaum being a street in the south of Paris. Right? I'm a Parisian. I'm from the tribe of the Paris slums, and so that kind of overlap between lower class Frenchmen, especially Parisians and natives, exactly where does the violence come from, right? Who is it native to? I think that's very important. And it is, I think, a contribution to recent scholarship on the French colonization of North Africa, which has in recent years really turned to the levels of violence, which scholars are now not hesitating to refer to as genocidal.
In addition to that, ethnic crossing and ethnic, reinforcing side, from an operational standpoint, the Zouave uniform, from the outset becomes tied to sort of unconventional tactics, right? Conventional tactics is, as Carol was describing, the standard uniform, a uniform that encased and disciplined your body, made you hold your head up, made you keep your back straight. And then you, in the infantry, and the Zouaves are infantry, we marched shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow, in this formation across a space. And the Zouave uniform is all about mobility. It's all about flexibility. It's the open collar, the shorter pants. The soldier is much more of an individual agent, prepared to operate in very small groups or alone, and to engage in unconventional tactics, whether those tactics are climbing a hill or engaging in a raid, as Carol said, some kind of small group sort of thing. And that's going to be a hallmark of the Zouave, which is an important part of sort of French military thinking that has global influence. Let's rethink the infantry, make them more flexible. It's going to have a great deal of influence in the United States as well.
So just going back, how did the idea for this book or even this subject come up? Like, how did you both agree on this subject to begin with? But why Zouave?
Well, so the original idea is mine, and it actually came out of my work on Roman Catholicism. So as I was working on my previous book on the French Catholic Church after the French Revolution, I got interested in the Pontifical Zouave. So these are the young men who went to Rome to defend the Papal States, so to defend the Pope's sovereignty over the city of Rome and its environs, and were fighting in Rome through the 1860s until 1870, when the city of Rome falls to the Kingdom of Italy. And it wasn't just a French movement, it was an international movement, but I was interested in the French Zouave soldiers. And at the time, I thought, gosh, there's a good article in the uniform, because it can't help. I mean, it struck people at the time, right? The Pope's defenders are dressed like North African tribesmen. Why would you do that? And there's an article in this. And to be honest, I sort of thought, well, there's an article in this, but God, I'd have to read a lot of Civil War history. There's so much about the U.S. Civil War, and that'd be a lot. So that's where Tom comes in. And he read all of that, and it turned out there's really substantially more than just an article. But it did actually start, and I think it's important that it started not in either France or the United States, but in the Papal States. So I think that vantage point really is why we really started off from the beginning with a sense of the global diffusion of the uniform.
Yeah, I want to touch on the Papal States in a bit, but I want to go back to France for a moment. I haven't had that much chance to read as much French history as I did during my undergraduate in Ottawa. So I really appreciate how the book uses the Zouave to explain, at least in part, the evolution of 19th century France, from the Second Bourbon Restoration to the July Monarchy, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, and finally the Third Republic, which is understandably not particularly straightforward for people who don't have a background in French history. You distinctly zone in on how the Zouave provided legitimacy for Napoleon III and the Second Empire, but it didn't lose respect of French citizens following France's loss in the Franco-Prussian War and the rise of the Third Republic. How did the Zouave and the image of the Zouave evolve with France's military and political establishment to play a new and different role in each consecutive government and maintain its popularity in France?
Well, first of all, thank you, because I really did try to make sure this book is accessible to people who are not historians of France. So I appreciate the kind words. That is one of the interesting pieces of the Zouave story, is they were very closely associated with the Second Empire of Napoleon III. A kind of personal relationship. He adds a unit of Zouave to his Imperial Guard. So that means they are often present in Paris. They are sort of part of the spectacle that Paris becomes under the Second Empire. This is the period when Paris is rebuilt along the lines that we currently know it, the Osmanization, the Baron Osman and Napoleon III renovate Paris and create the grand boulevards and the great monuments that we know today. Well, the Zouaves were there, right? They were part of that spectacle. They were often around the emperor. They had a particularly close relationship with the heir to the throne, the Prince Imperial, dressed as a Zouave quite often, drilled troops dressed as a Zouave. And so there's this tight relationship between these particularly ferocious imperial soldiers and the emperor. Surprisingly, in some ways, the Zouave make the transition to the Republic that replaces the Second Empire in 1870 quite seamlessly. The Imperial Guard is, of course, disbanded because there's no more emperor, but the Zouave themselves really barely miss a beat. They are the quintessential soldiers of the French Empire in the Third Republic that lasts until the Second World War. And I think the key to that transition is that for both the Empire, the Zouaves of the Empire and the Zouaves of the Third Republic, the Zouave is a quintessentially democratic figure, right? So in the Zouave unit, officers dress as French officers, right? They wear the tight trousers with the crease, they wear the buttoned up jacket, they wear the high collar. It's the flashy uniform belongs to the men, which is relatively unusual, right? Traditionally, flashy uniforms go with the officer corps. But the Zouave, the élan of the Zouave is that of the ordinary soldier. It is, in that sense, a sort of democratic institution. Any soldier, any ordinary guy can be the one who wears the uniform, who runs across the field with his comrades, who shows individual élan, who is particularly effective and demonstrates initiative. And that was, it spoke to the kind of democratic nature of the Second Empire, which may sound a little bit contradictory, but the Second Empire was built on the notion of the plebiscite. It was built on the notion of universal manhood suffrage, that every so often the entire French population would go to the polls and vote yes. I mean, they didn't have other choices. That's the nature of the plebiscite, but they would vote yes to supporting the emperor. And so that transitioned relatively easy to a more genuinely democratic or representative democracy under the Republic.
Right. And so the book, just in general, uses such a exceptionally wide variety of sources, official military documents, paintings, plays, newspaper articles on both sides of the Atlantic, all of which speak to, I think, the strength of your thesis and book, but also the recognizability of the Zouave in the mid-19th century. How did the image of the Zouave become so ubiquitous in so many different areas of the world?
Well, part of it has to do with the technology of diffusing these images. The Zouave rises with the Illustrated magazine, and so the emergence of L'Illustration in Paris, and then Harper's Weekly and
Illustrated
Frank
London
Leslie's
News.
in the United States, Illustrated London News. Um, that was an important part of the rise of the consolidation of the Zouave as a type of 19th century transnational culture. Then there were more, other forms, higher art forms like painting, of which there are a heck of a lot of paintings of Zouaves, and they play an important role in early photography. But if you talk about one that really was the muscle behind the Zouaves, it would be the Illustrated magazine.
And it's knockoffs, like, for instance, the little paper soldiers.
Yes,
Right?
which, yes.
Cheaply reproduced, mass produced all over the world.
Yeah.
And one of the things we find really interesting about the Zouave is that Zouave soldiers feature in the last grand battle paintings. So the mid-19th century is sort of the last gasp of traditional big scale battlefield art. And so the last grand paintings of battles, which mostly come from the Crimea, almost all feature Zouave, right? Because they're striking, they're colorful, they're characters. They won the war, right? So you see Zouave in all the last grand battle paintings, but you also see Zouave in the very first war photographs, which also come out of the Crimea. So Zouaves make that transition from the sort of large scale wall size paintings to the first photographs taken on the battlefield, or photographs that pretend they were taken on the battlefield more often.
Speaking of winning the Crimean War, from the Franco-Prussian War, like the image that I think a lot of people, if they ever think of the Franco-Prussian War, is like the picture of the defeated Napoleon III in the chair and Bismarck. But were there paintings of the Zouaves from this Franco-Prussian War, or not so much because they lost?
That's what, like, the last cartridge, yeah.
Yeah, there are. Military art by 1870 had moved a little more away from the grand battle painting and towards genre paintings. Yeah. So sort of scenes of military life. Definitely the most famous French painting of the Franco-Prussian War. It's not actually a Zouave, it's a Turco. But similar, the uniform is very similar, and it's again a North African unit. And it's a genre painting, meaning it's a relatively small scale. It's a group of soldiers. They are in basically somebody's living room in a kind of a village that has become a battle scene, and it's called The Last Cartridges, right? And so it's this group of soldiers who are down to their very last cartridges. And so it's not the big glorious battle scene narrative. It's a small, intimate group of soldiers, but the fact that it's a Turco is important, right? Here is this Turco defending France down to his very last shots.
It was such an iconic painting that when cinema developed in Paris in the 1890s, there were 3 different movies that turned that painting into films that would last a minute and a half or something like that. In those films, the Turco, and Turcos are basically African-born soldiers in Zouave outfits, turned the Turco into a Zouave, French-born soldier. So, there's an example of the ways in which, the Zouave is part of a visual tradition, a tradition that really has sort of its wellspring in the grand battle paintings. And that tradition has, its splinters, it has reactions, it has movements, this shift that Carol mentions towards genre, the rise of new media like photography and cinema. And the Zouave was embedded in that visual tradition all the way.
So to move to the United States a bit, the Zouave dress appears in the US right before the Civil War. What precipitated this move across the Atlantic, and how was it received by American society?
It's interesting. It's a movement that it's easy to focus too narrowly on the military side. And it's important to remember that the Zouave outfit had become, in the Crimean War and then in the war in Italy in 1859, a piece of stage costume and a piece of civilian fashion. That women wore Zouave jackets as a matter of style. And the civilian fashion and the stage costumes come to the United States in the way that stage costumes and civilian fashions often came from Paris to the United States. Paris was was a cultural center and exported things like this. And so those are part of the American repertory at the same time that Elmer Ellsworth really turns the Zouave into a figure at the very heart of the American military imagination. And Ellsworth's motivation is Ellsworth wanted to reinvigorate the militia, an institution that was basically collapsing. It's probably not too inaccurate to say in the 1850s. He took over a unit that was on the verge of disbanding, and they asked him to be the commander. And he rebranded it. He made it a Zouave uniform outfit that wore Zouave clothes and had a Zouave name. And he turned him into this precision drill team that he could take on tour. That was in some ways like the French model. In some ways, it was quite different, right? The French Zouaves were sort of ruffians. They had a tradition, a very strong reputation for camaraderie, but they weren't about precision because they weren't about discipline. Whereas Ellsworth's guys, that was the idea, is precision drill, highly disciplined, choreographed, you would even say. And Ellsworth's tour with the U.S. Zouave cadets in the summer of 1860 was like Taylor Swift's tour this past summer, right? It took the country by storm. And Ellsworth is, one of the most famous people in the country at the end of that tour, and he immediately joins the presidential campaign of his friend Abraham Lincoln. And the Zouave is now a major figure to think about as the Civil War gears up. But it's a figure that is not strictly a matter of going from the French military to the American military, because Ellsworth is part of this, the show business side of Zouaves, right? He was engaged in putting on spectacles. So, that's a cool feature of it.
Right, and you also talk about how Zouavery was an urban phenomenon in both France and the United States. What about the Zouave uniform really inspired urban city dwellers compared to the rural counterparts?
In the United States, an important agency for that was the Volunteer Fire Company. Volunteer fire companies were tremendously influential sites for defining manliness in mid-19th century America, especially in the big cities, New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. And when the Civil War begins, the volunteer fire companies are going to be important sites of recruiting and of turning that kind of organized, semi-organized manliness into soldiers. And a lot of those guys wanted to be Zouaves, right? They looked at Ellsworth, they looked at the Zouaves on the stage, and they said, that's my idea of a soldier, right? He's an individual hero. He's got a lot of flash. The common man is in charge. And it's very closely related to the stage, right? The volunteer firefighter is an icon of masculinity. Think of the volunteer firefighter as playing a role in the American imagination, not comparable to what the cowboy would later play, right? Just sort of like the epitome of manliness. Well, a lot of that came from the stage, right? There's this famous figure, Mose, who was, one of the most iconic theatrical characters of mid-19th century America. And so the firefighter is poised between, theater and real life. I mean, putting out fires. And so is the Zouave, who is poised between theater and real life, going to war. And so, as I say, lots of firefighters wanted to be Zouaves.
Makes sense. But at the same time, how did it really compare to other military uniforms and other stage productions that were on? Why did so many soldiers and citizens in both Europe and the United States prefer the Zouave costume and adopt it both in society as fashion and on the battlefield?
Well, remember, these are very different institutional contexts. In France, this is a highly centralized organization. This is the French army. And in the United States and the Papal States, this is a matter of volunteers, right? This is not the uniform of the United States Army, although the United States Army during the war thought about changing its official infantry uniform to look a little more like the French chasseurs, which says something about the influence of France and specifically this kind of athletic vision of infantry. But the Zouave is, as Ellsworth is putting it forward, this is an alternative to the U.S. Army, right? This is an alternative. This is the militia. This is an institutional and sartorial alternative to what the regulation army is offering. That's quite different from France.
Yeah, in France, this is the army of the nation, and certainly the Zouave soldier comes to stand for the nation, and particularly the imperial nation. But it's not. I mean, in the U.S., Tom's discussion of the U.S. volunteers, it's tremendous latitude as people recruit Civil War soldiers. What do you think would look good? What do you want to wear?
And hey,
what if we all go to war dressed as this or that? Yeah.
And if you're willing to come and you got to wear that outfit, then hey, wear that outfit as long as you're coming.
Yeah.
Right. That was basically the attitude of the Union Army. We can deal with that if that's what you want to wear. There was not a whole lot of discipline. There become practical issues of like what access you're going to have to supplies. But those Union depots that are run by the Quartermaster General's office, they make Zouave uniforms, right? And if your outfit insists on wearing a Zouave uniform, okay, we'll get you a Zouave uniform as long as you're fighting. Anyhow, to say it's highly decentralized.
How did it play a part in the Confederate Army as well?
It not completely dissimilar. Some things are distinctive to the southern side. So one thing that is distinctive to the southern side is New Orleans and the way New Orleans has this French influence that exceeded the French influence in any other part of the United States. There were traces, manifestations of that French influence in New York too. French immigrants who wanted to be Zouaves because they saw this as the most French way to participate in the war. But that is a disproportionately New Orleans thing. And so an awful lot of the Confederate Zouaves come from New Orleans, and it's more about being French than it is in, let's say, Philadelphia or Chicago or even New York. But in New Orleans, as in the major northeastern cities, there is that important theatrical input. There's a very dynamic theatrical scene in New Orleans, and there are Zouaves on stage before there are Zouaves in the field. So that kind of dynamic is going on. The other really big feature, and so similarly, it's largely an urban phenomenon. The South, of course, is a much less urban place. So aside from New Orleans, you've got pockets of Zouaves in places like Charleston, South Carolina, in Richmond. But there's going to be fewer Zouaves in the Confederacy, and that is going to be deeply compounded by the kind of supply challenges the Confederacy is going to face. Right? It's going to be hard to provide people with the uniform they want. So the Zouave does not die out in the Union Army. There are people dressed in full Zouave outfits at Appomattox. But the Zouave largely, as a look, fades from the Confederate Army strictly from supply side issues.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to go back to the gendered aspect of Zouaverie. The book mentions that both men and women could wear the Zouave uniform and did so both fashionably and in military camps, and that male Zouaves would sometimes perform in drag for comic purposes, and that the costume itself, like the outfit of Scottish Highlanders, was itself a form of gender cross-dressing. How did Zouaverie play into the mid-19th century conception of gender?
Well, the Zouave cross-dressing really starts in the Crimean War. And the Crimea is the moment when Zouave fame goes worldwide. It is the moment when their opponent is no longer villages of North African natives, but another European army. And so Zouaves rising to the challenge is important, but it's also the point at which the theatrical element of Zouave performance really comes to the fore, because French Zouaves become very famous for their battlefront theater. The Crimea involved a certain amount of, or found quite a lot of, sitting around and waiting for our soldiers, a kind of miserable winter, famously, and then a pretty miserable summer as well. And battlefield theater is part of what they did. And these performances, in which, of course, Zouave played all the roles, including the female roles, were famous. They were covered in the French and the British and then in the American press. Crucially, the Zouaves were not performing the women's roles because there were no women there. There were women. There were vivandières, cantinières, who were particularly associated with the Zouave, partly because the Zouave's uniform and the cantinière's uniform, she had kind of a matching uniform. And that was traditional in the French army, that the women who did laundry, sold liquor, tobacco, things like that, would have a kind of jacket and a sort of uniform that echoed that of the soldiers they served. But the Zouaves were particularly similar because, of course, her skirt looked a lot like their trousers, right? The silhouette was very similar. So Zouaves are performing these shows in which, the leading lady is some bearded Zouave, with a wig on and jewelry. Not because there are no women there, because the vivandière is taking the ticket money. She is there, but she's not on stage. The fun is the cross-dressing. And this cross-dressing becomes, it also is a big success. One of the vectors by which French Zouaves enter the United States is that after the Crimean War, there is a group of performing Zouave veterans called the Inkerman Zouave, who go on an international tour that includes the US. They're a huge hit in New Orleans in particular. And they do some of these kind of cross-dressed routines. And the most famous story that gets repeated, and then it's written into a play that is performed in Paris and is also performed in New York, is the story of the Zouave Theater, which is kind of a play within a play. Zouaves put on a play in the Crimea. And this was at least allegedly a true story. You hear guns in the background. The Russians are attacking the Zouave, pick up their skirts. They grab their weapons, and Zouaves go off to war in drag. Wildly popular story. So that kind of piece of theater and cross-dressing is really there from the beginning. But even Zouaves who are not cross-dressed on stage, there is always this sense that there's a kind of frisson associated with this kind of ferocious man in a silhouette that looks vaguely feminine, right? The giant trousers look like petticoats. It looks like a wide skirt. And this is why I think there's a certain kinship with the Highlanders, right? Also ferocious, primitive soldiers in a very kind of quasi-effeminate outfit. And that's part of the appeal from the beginning.
And in the United States, you've got similar pieces involved in terms of gender and stage, but they play out a little bit differently. In the United States, it's more important how common Zouave clothing was among women. The Zouave jacket, as I said, was just a staple in the wardrobe of the well-dressed woman in the 1860s, that she'd wear a Zouave jacket. And in the United States, unlike France, the Zouave trousers had a resonance with bloomers, right? There's a whole national issue of like women wearing trousers and bloomers, and so Zouave trousers for women have a real kind of traction, which ties into things like athleticism. Women doing exercises in kind of a Zouave outfit basically becomes quite common. And women on the stage as Zouaves are much bigger in the United States than in France, right? So the kind of dance drill that Ellsworth is basically having his men do, this sort of choreographed drill is related to things that women were doing before Ellsworth and after Ellsworth. So one of the most important proto-musicals in the history of Broadway was a production called The Seven Sisters, put together by Laura Keene, the most important American actress of the late 1850s and 1860s, of course, the star of Our American Cousin when Lincoln's assassinated. And Laura Keene's The Seven Sisters, which ran on Broadway for like 9 months, I guess, continuously, huge run in those days. Lincoln saw it on his way to the White House in 1860. It was the hit musical of its time. It centers on a big Zouave dance drill, right? 40 women wearing Zouave costumes, with rifles and, doing kind of a early Beyonce formation sort of thing. And that kind of production, of course, had imitators. There are lots of productions like that in the Civil War. So the idea of women wearing Zouave costumes is very widespread in the United States, has a lot of theatrical influence. And then, like Carol said, people saw it and thought it looked like a petticoat. So certainly is referred to as, a Zouave petticoat in the United States. And there are people who record these instances of, civilians seeing a Zouave unit emerge and saying, oh my gosh, it's a unit of women. So it has this kind of cross-gender influence or reputation in the U.S.
I mean, I just saw a few months ago a production of The Daughter of the Regiment, which you mentioned a few times in your
Yes.
book, and they were just done by Chicago Opera. And so, like, these ideas of, well, French theater, 19th century theater, especially opera, that's inspired by Zouaverie or has aspects of Zouaverie are still being in use, even though the costume might not be in vogue. I think the one they had here in Chicago, they set in World War I, and so it was a bit different, but it still had those aspects of the woman and being fawned over by this entire regiment and the intermixing of the two. So on the same note, we already kind of talked about Zouave and minstrelsy and blackface, but I was wondering if you could get into that a bit more. You used the term racial cross-dressing. I was wondering if you could define racial cross-dressing and how does Zouaverie fit into that?
Well, it originates in this European fantasy of an African look. And that is a lot of what blackface was, right? This white appropriation of black style and black fantasy. Love and Theft is famously, appropriation of black styles. And so as soon as the Zouave emerged as a thing in American culture, Bryant's minstrels are all over it. And they have a spoof of Ellsworth's U.S. Zouave cadets, and they tinker with it, and they develop these routines. They develop their longest lasting routine is something called the Zouave polka, which was, I think, really a clever idea because it tapped into the ways in which military drill, is not unrelated to dance and has been related to dance in kind of a changing way over time. And so that in an 18th century world, you've got a drill that is kind of highly mannered in the age of the minuet, right? And then you've got kind of move into the age of the waltz, and you have more of a sort of free-flowing sort of drill, more concerned with elegance, let's say. And sort of graceful movement and evolutions. People used to refer to drill as evolutions, right? That fits kind of the world of the waltz. As Bryant's minstrels recognized, that the polka was a big fad, and the polka is about one thing. It's about the folk. It's about kind of aestheticizing the folk, and in this case, the black folk. And it's also a lot more herky-jerky. And a lot less concerned with gracefulness. It's more rambunctious, more animated. And so that sort of was a Zouave persona. And so that's an example of a way in which a performing troupe, performing in blackface, portrays and interprets Zouaverie through the war. right? That's the kind of thing you would see on stage in the 1860s.
Right. So to kind of change gears a little bit, the book mentions the French intervention in Mexico only a couple times, but the Mexican Empire is founded at the height of Zouavery in the United States and France. So did French Zouaves serve in Mexico during the intervention? And if so, what role did they play?
That's why the Mexicans were psyched about Cinco de Mayo. They'd beaten the Zouaves.
Yeah, the Battle of Puebla, that was Zouaves they defeated. And
Yeah.
they knew perfectly well they defeated these famously effective, fierce troops. And so, if you look at today, the murals that are in the old Imperial Palace in Chapultepec in Mexico City, these are giant murals. It's the battlefield, the battle painting tradition. They're murals of Mexicans defeating Zouave. They they are psyched about it. It's important that there's Zouave.
To some extent, the history of Zouaves is the history of the French Empire. And so we don't really narrate, well, the Zouaves were here in Mexico in, 1864, and then they were in, Vietnam in 1880 or whatever.
They were everywhere.
But they were, yes, they were the advance guard of the French Empire. Is very true about Mexico.
So the meaning of Zouave uniform changes once again when it's adopted by the volunteers of the Papal States that you mentioned earlier, in opposition to the army of the new unified Italian state. So who were these pontifical Zouaves, and why did they decide to adopt the Zouave uniform?
Young men, volunteer, and some older men from all over Catholic Christendom, mostly European, but not entirely. They're Americans, they're Canadians, famously, large numbers. And they go to Rome to defend papal sovereignty over Rome and its environs. And they dress as Zouave. Partly it is because their commander is a Frenchman who had commanded in North Africa. So he had made most of his career in the French army in North Africa in the 1840s, especially. So he was very much associated with Zouave. But it's also significant that adopting Zouave dress, again, it's the crossing, it's the transgression that makes it fun and that makes it intriguing. That it's devout young Catholic men wearing the uniform of, one, North African Muslims, but two, sort of famously ill-disciplined, rowdy ladies' men. So what they're doing is taking this uniform that has all of these existing connotations and adding another layer and Catholicizing it, right? So now it's being worn by young men who would, of course, never imagine having a girl in every garrison they're in. They have a sweetheart back home, and if they survive, they'll marry her. But of course, they may not survive, because this is also a kind of quest for martyrdom. Which is not a part of, Zouaverie in, say, the United States or the French army. You're not looking to die, but many of these young men basically were. So that the substrate on which the kind of Catholic devotional culture is laid remains important. And again, it's the intrigue of being both at the same time.
Right. And so to actually, because I'm Canadian, I have to look at the Canadian aspect of it. I think we are not allowed we don't have a choice as Canadians except to look at the Canadian aspect. But you said that Zouaverie basically has its last stand in Quebec. Why?
Well, certainly Catholic Zouaverie does. And actually, no, I think that probably is the last stand, because the French Zouave, the French army has disbanded all its Zouave units. They're disbanded in 1962 with the independence of Algeria. But in the 1960s, Catholic Zouave are still marching and drilling, and they're largely a social club. So a fairly sizable, significant contingent of Pontifical Zouaves is recruited out of the Diocese of Montreal, mostly urban, again, mostly Montrealers. And they arrive. The recruitment is very much a kind of project of the Bishop of Montreal, and it is a way of kind of mobilizing young Catholic men to remind them that their future should be with the church and not with encroaching Protestantism. And they go to Rome, and they get there basically too late. For the city of Rome has basically already fallen by the time they arrive there. But their service remains important to them, and they go back to Canada and they establish a veterans organization. They remain in touch with other Pontifical Zouave veterans, but the Canadian ones basically can keep going longer than anybody else. The original veterans invite their sons to join, and then in the next generation, they basically invite other young Catholic men to join, and they wear the Zouave outfit, and they perform the manual of arms, they drill. But by the mid 20th century, the 1960s and 70s, it's basically a social club. So they are a wholesome thing for young Catholic Francophone men to do. So they organize bingo tournaments and outings to places, sometimes pilgrimages, sometimes less devout. But they are kind of a symbol of French Catholic resistance to Protestantism, to Anglophone rule, also to communism. They're very anti-communist in the mid-century. And really, their last act, I think not insignificantly, is that the very last of the Canadian Zouave suit up and they are wearing their uniforms when John Paul II visits on his first big papal tour.
I mean, that tour, I think, is still very prominent in the minds of a lot of Canadians. Like, it was huge, especially in Quebec, and it was at the end of the Quiet Revolution. It had such a larger impact. And then obviously it dies down. Well, the idea of Zouaverie, Catholic Zouaverie in Quebec, I assume, dies down as the Quiet Revolution really takes hold.
The Quiet Revolution is what really does it in. Because Catholic Zouaverie in Quebec is very much a feature of a fairly isolated and insular society. And the Quiet Revolution that really opens Quebec up, Zouaverie does not survive that. And opening it up means opening up Quebec up to a wide influence of youth culture, right? That's exactly what these Zouave associations are trying to avoid, is the importation of youth culture from, for instance, the United States. And by the late 60s and early 70s, the idea that what young men should do is really dress up in military uniforms and march around and drill is nobody wants to do that anymore. Young people are not interested in that.
Yeah, I can't imagine people marching down the streets of Montreal at the moment, well, except in strikes. But
not announcing that they want to be soldiers.
Yeah, no, definitely not. The French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War had a much greater impact on the image of the Zouave in the United States than in France. Why did this defeat lead to the Zouave's downfall in popularity in the United States? And why didn't it have the same impact in France, despite the Zouave role of providing legitimacy for the Second Empire?
Well, that's because there was a group poised to make the most of the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and to blame it on the Zouaves in the United States. And that group was the regular U.S. Army and the militia leaders who wanted to make the militia more like the army. Right? In the pre-Civil War America, there's never any question the militia is going to be much like the army. In post-Civil War America, there's room for debate and different paths. And the basic, long story of the militia there is that the groups who want to make the militia more like the U.S. Army win out. And they get control of the militia state by state. And getting control of the militia means expelling Zouave units, among other things, and making the militia dress like the army and train like the army and so on. And so that's an agenda item from the end of the Civil War. And French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War is just an opportunity for these people to say, French way doesn't work. Down with the Zouave uniform, out with the Zouave uniform. Right? They were already saying out with the Zouave uniform 5 years earlier. But the Franco-Prussian War provided them with another argument. And that's a process that happens state by state that is underway in the late 1860s that is fairly complete by, let's say, 1890. And so by 1890, the Zouave uniform in the United States is not really an active military uniform of any established organizations. It is strictly something that appears in show business. It appears very widely in show business. And so you've got all kinds of Zouave troops performing in circuses and Wild West shows and things like that for the next 30 years or so.
I think that's one of the great ironies of the book, is that American Zouave come back to France as part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show.
But it's been pushed out of the military.
Yeah, and like on that note, when did Zouaverie fall out of vogue militarily, religiously, and culturally in France?
Well, the First World War is an important moment. Zouave go to war in 1914 in their red trousers and their open jackets. And the battlefield has changed dramatically by 1914. Notably, by the last decade or so of the 19th century, smokeless powder. So in the 19th century, people often say, like, why would you wear these red trousers? Doesn't it just make you an easy target? Well, no, not if the battlefield is so covered in black powder that you can't actually see anything. An easily recognizable uniform, right? Those are my guys. I can see the red or I can see the silhouette. Those are my guys. That's an advantage, right? Visibility is more important in many ways than invisibility. That has changed by the Second World War. Now, the French army goes to war in 1914 in their traditional uniforms, all the units. There is a debate in 1914, 1915 about modifying the uniforms. There is pushback. There's a very famous French general who basically says, le pantalon rouge, c'est la France. France is the red trousers. You're not the French army if you're not wearing red trousers, because the entire French infantry wore red trousers, right? I mean, the Zouave just wore baggy ones, but everybody wore red trousers. But the trenches of the Western Front do lead to a modification. Warmer clothing, for one thing. If you're going to fight in northern France through the winter, you need a jacket that buttons up. The Zouave uniforms are cold.
You need a helmet.
You need a helmet, yes. Nobody in any army in 1914 wore helmets. So helmets come into all of the armies in the First World War. So that's the point at which Zouave uniforms become parade dress. But they remain parade dress. And the French create more Zouave units. So there are new Zouave units created through the First World War and into the interwar period. And there are Zouaves in the Second World War, and they continue to wear the traditional parade dress. It's the independence of Algeria. It's the Algerian War and the end of French colonialism in Algeria that ends the Zouave units. By 1962, when Algeria is independent, by the 50s, really, Zouave soldiers are very much associated with white settlers in Algeria, who are the diehard opposition to French retreat from the colony. And so the independence of Algeria marks the end of all French Zouave regiments.
So was that kind of a part of the fall of the Fourth Republic and the creation of the Fifth Republic?
Yes.
Just getting rid of the Zouave was another change that de Gaulle really pushed forward?
I think it was, I don't know to what extent de Gaulle was involved personally in that. But yes, I mean, the Fourth Republic falls over the question of Algeria. It is de Gaulle who sort of sees the writing on the wall, acknowledges and recognizes Algerian independence, and disbanding the Zouave comes immediately after that. And I emphasize this because the French do not abandon all colonial military units, right? There are still units in the French army that wear sort of traditional dress that is a kind of fantasy of colonialism that still exist in the French army. There are Swahi units, which is a kind of North African native cavalry. And they still, when there is an important ceremony, they come out in these very elaborate, sort of fantastic, Bedouinish kind of outfits. But the Zouave are so closely associated with the white settler population that is so deeply opposed to Algerian independence that there is no future for Zouave in the Fifth Republic.
So I have one last question, and I'm just wondering if anything similar to the image of the Zouave existed in France, like something that maintained its importance and popularity from the Bourbon Restoration to the Third and it sounds like the Fourth Republic. And why did the Zouave have such staying power?
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that question. That's a good one. Off the top of my head, what comes to mind is the tricolor, right? So the Bourbon Restoration does abandon the tricolor, or they insist on the Bourbon flag, the white flag with gold lilies. Restoring the revolutionary tricolor is an important element of the July monarchy, and it becomes a symbol of the Republic. Napoleon certainly never, Napoleon III maintains the tricolor. And I think there's a certain similarity, which is that they are both symbols of French democracy, not necessarily Republican democracy, because we get the plebiscitary democracy of the Second Empire. But that's the example that comes to mind.
It's a good one. Mm-hmm.
And it remains like really contentious. Like one of the reasons why one of the like negotiating points that is a sticking point when there's an effort to return a Bourbon monarch to the throne in France after the Second Empire, because the idea that the Third Republic the idea that the Napoleon will fall and be succeeded by a republic is not obvious, right? There's real possibility of a return of a Bourbon monarch. One of the sticking points in the negotiations is the tricolor.
I think that's a great moment to end on. So thank you once again for taking the time to talk to me about your book, and I wish you the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.